They said it was for science. But a declassified memo dated March 22nd, 1952 uses cold, bureaucratic language to lay out a new initiative. It talks about things like covert support and operational requirements, a partnership between the Department of Defense and the brand new Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. But if you read between the lines of the government jargon, the real objectives were horrifying. To stockpile severely incapacitating and lethal materials, and to create special and unique items for the dissemination of biological and chemical material. This memo wasn't just starting a project, it was announcing the birth of a monster. Now, we've all heard the whispers about the CIA's mind control programs. The name MKULTRA is infamous. It brings to mind LSD experiments, psychological torture, and a paranoid government desperate to unlock the human mind. But what if I told you MKUltra wasn't an only child? What if it had a sibling? A darker, quieter, and far more lethal twin, born from the exact same Cold War fear. A program that wasn't about controlling minds, but about delivering silent, untraceable death. This is the story of MK-NAOMI, a joint CIA and Army project so secret that for decades, almost no one knew its name. It's a story that takes place behind the quiet gates of a seemingly ordinary Army base in rural Maryland called Fort Detrick. A place where for 20 years the line between fighting a war and committing the perfect murder blurred into nothing. It's the story of a real-life arsenal of horrors, poisoned darts, toxic pens, and it's the story of the human guinea pigs, the men who patriotically volunteered to serve their country, never knowing that the real goal was to measure the precise dosage of a nightmare. They thought they were helping create vaccines, but the data stolen from their suffering was used to perfect weapons. This is the declassified reality of America's forgotten toxin program. So just 50 miles from the marble monuments of Washington, D.C., nestled in the hills of Frederick, Maryland, lies Fort Detrick. If you drove past it today, you wouldn't think twice. It looks like any other military base, trimmed lawns, functional buildings, a high fence, etc. It's now a world-class campus for biomedical research, a key player in the defense against everything from Ebola to new viruses. But this modern, respectable image is built on a foundation of terrifying secrets. From the very beginning, Fort Detrick was a place built on paranoia. The secrecy was so total that its real purpose during World War II, as the heart of America's biological weapons program, wasn't revealed to the public until months after the war was over. The work was so compartmentalized that even inside the CIA, only a handful of officers ever knew the full story of what happened in those labs. This place wasn't just designed to contain the world's most dangerous germs, but also its own dark history. To understand the horrors that grew at Fort Detrick, you first have to understand the fear that planted the seeds. The world had just seen the raw power of the atomic bomb, but a new, quieter threat was creeping into the American mind. Brainwashing. High-profile stories like the televised, seemingly forced confession of a Hungarian cardinal and the shocking accounts of American POWs confessing to war crimes in Korea sent a wave of panic all the way to the top of the CIA. Could the Soviets really reprogram a person? Could they turn an American spy or even a diplomat into a sleeper agent? This terror gave birth to Project Artichoke, and later, the infamous MKUltra. These were the CIA's first attempts to figure out mind control. They were sprawling, chaotic programs where the agency dosed its own citizens with LSD, from prisoners to people in brothels, all in a desperate search for a key to unlock human behavior. They tried hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and psychological abuse, breaking every ethical rule and law in the book. MKUltra is the program everyone remembers, the one that became the stuff of conspiracy legend. But while the CIA scientists were exploring the mind, they were also pushing the limits of the body. They weren't just developing truth serums, they were weaponizing nature's deadliest poisons. This parallel track This darker path was codenamed MK-NAOMI. While MKULTRA was about control, MK-NAOMI was about death. It wasn't about making a target talk, it was about making them disappear. It was a joint program between the CIA's Technical Services Division, the agency's real-life Q branch, and the Army's Super Secret Special Operations Division, or SOD, based at Fort Detrick. Their mission, spelled out in declassified documents, was to create and maintain a stockpile of deadly biological and chemical agents. They were told to develop unique delivery systems for these agents, covert weapons that could kill someone in a crowd, leaving no clues and no culprit. If MKULTRA was a chaotic madman, MK-NAOMI was the quiet professional. It was where the fear of mind control met the cold, hard science of assassination. And Fort Detrick was at the heart of it all. The story of Fort Detrick doesn't start with the Cold War, but in the middle of World War II. In 1942, chilling reports started coming back to Washington that Japan was using germ warfare in China. The Japanese military's infamous Unit 731 was doing barbaric experiments on prisoners, and the fear was they were weaponizing diseases like plague and anthrax. The United States decided it needed to be ready for the same kind of fight. It needed its own bioweapons program, if, only as a threat. The Army found a brilliant biochemist from the University of Wisconsin named Ira Baldwin and gave him a mission: find a place to build it. He picked a quiet, isolated Army airfield near Frederick, Maryland called Detrick Field. Its isolation was perfect. In 1943, the site was rapidly expanded, renamed Camp Detrick, and the government bought up all the surrounding farmland to create a buffer zone from the outside world. The US Army Biological Warfare Laboratories were officially in business. Inside those fences, scientists cooked up a terrifying menu of diseases. They figured out how to mass-produce anthrax spores and botulinum toxins, the most poisonous substance on the planet. They designed bombs and systems to spread these agents, all in the name of preparing for a war that thankfully never happened. When the atomic bombs fell on Japan, the nuclear age began, and for a little while, germ warfare seemed to fade into the background. But the peace didn't last. The Cold War brought a new kind of enemy, and a new kind of paranoia. The enemy wasn't in a uniform anymore. It was a shadowy network of spies. The battlefield wasn't just a place on a map, it was the hearts and minds of the people all over the world. As we mentioned, the fear of Soviet brainwashing became an obsession for American intelligence. The CIA was convinced it was losing a secret arms race for control of the human mind. And so they turned to Fort Detrick. The mission started to change. The focus wasn't just on huge bioweapons for a massive war anymore, but on something new: tools for spies. The CIA's Technical Services Division, led by the mysterious chemist Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, started working closely with Fort Detrick's Special Operations Division. This partnership was the moment everything changed: the unholy marriage of biological warfare and covert espionage. Their shared goal was to build an arsenal of poisons that could be used for sabotage, disruption, and assassination. They needed weapons that were subtle, deniable, and terrifyingly effective. This was the directive that spawned the alphabet soup of secret projects: Bluebird, Artichoke, MKULTRA, and its deadly twin, MK-NAOMI. Under MK-NAOMI, the scientists at Fort Detrick were no longer just preparing for a hypothetical war with the Soviets. They were actively creating the tools for real-world spying and killing. They started researching and collecting an inventory of toxins that could cause heart attacks, mimic the symptoms of other diseases, or just bring on a quick, untraceable death. They studied paralytic shellfish poison, cobra venom, and dozens of other lethal agents. The lab that was built for a world war had found a new, darker purpose in the shadows of the Cold War. It went from being a factory of mass destruction to a boutique for the perfect murder weapon. It was a place where science had been cut loose from ethics, driven by a paranoia so deep that it could justify just about anything. The question was no longer if they could create these things, so much as how could they test them. And to perfect their poisonous toolkit, they were going to need some people. To perfect a weapon, you have to see what it does to a person. To make a vaccine, you have to understand the disease. For the scientists at Fort Detrick, this simple fact led to one of the most morally bankrupt chapters in American military history, Operation Whitecoat. Starting in 1954 and running for almost 20 years, Operation Whitecoat used more than 2,300 enlisted American soldiers as human test subjects. But these weren't just any soldiers, they were almost all Seventh-day Adventists, men whose faith made them conscientious objectors. They wanted to serve their country, but refused to carry a gun. The military gave them a choice: go to the front lines in a place like Vietnam as an unarmed medic, or volunteer for a special program at Fort Detrick to test new vaccines that could save American lives. Faced with that decision, many chose the what seemed to be the safer and more patriotic path. They were called the Whitecoats. They were young, healthy men, full of a sense of duty. They were told they were heroes, pioneers saving the country from a new kind of threat. And in some ways they were. The work they did helped lead to FDA-approved vaccines for diseases like yellow fever and hepatitis. But that noble story was masking a much darker truth. The volunteers signed consent forms, but the idea of informed consent was stretched well past the point where it broke. They were told about some of the risks, but they could never really understand the full danger or the long-term effects. The experiments themselves were pure nightmare fuel. Volunteers were marched into giant sealed steel spheres, the most famous one known as the 8-ball. Inside, they'd be strapped into chairs and have a mask put over their face. Then, an aerosolized cloud of germs would be pumped into the chamber. They were deliberately infected with Q fever, and even the bubonic plague. Afterwards, they were taken to a secure medical ward and watched, their symptoms carefully recorded as the diseases tore through their bodies. Doctors were there to treat them, but only after they had collected all the data that they needed. These men were human measuring sticks. Their fevers, their pain, their delirium, it was all just priceless, soulless data. It helped the army understand exactly how much of a biological agent it took to incapacitate or kill a person, while the official goal was defensive. To make vaccines and gear to protect soldiers, the knowledge was dual use. Learning how to protect your soldiers from Q fever is the exact same as learning how to use Q fever against an enemy soldier. The psychological cost was enormous. The isolation, the fear, and for many a deep sense of betrayal that never really healed. They'd signed up out of faith and patriotism, and they had been used as living test tubes. For years, the army did almost nothing to track their long-term health. While official reports claimed no one died during the tests and long-term problems were conclusively attributed to them, that was mainly because a real follow-up was never done. Of the 2,300 volunteers, the army only had addresses for about 1,000, and only a few of those were ever surveyed. The men of Operation Whitecoat were the known test subjects, but they weren't the only ones. The CIA's mind control programs reached into prisons and hospitals where unsuspecting people were dosed with drugs and tortured under the banner of MKULTRA. In one horrific experiment, a prison doctor in Kentucky gave 7 black inmates double, triple, and quadruple doses of LSD for 77 days straight. What happened to these men? We don't know. Their records, like so many others, just disappeared. These were the forgotten victims, the casualties in a secret war fought in the labs and cells of their own country. Their suffering provided the raw data needed to perfect the weapons of MK-NAOMI. The story of what happened to these men, both the volunteers and the victims, is a chilling reminder of how far a secret government will go in the name of national security. The files were burned, the test subjects were forgotten, and the truth was buried for decades. And the story only gets darker from here. The weapons they helped create were more diabolical than you can imagine. If you believe these hidden histories need to be brought into light, make sure you subscribe and click the bell, because you do not want to miss what comes next. The data taken from the sickbeds of the Whitecoat volunteers was pure gold. Every fever spike, every night spent in agony gave the scientists a clear picture of how these agents worked on a human body. And while this was all publicly sold as defensive research, inside the secret partnership between the CIA and Fort Detrick, it was being used to build a terrifyingly sophisticated poisoner's toolkit. This was the entire point of Project MK-NAOMI. Declassified CIA memos from the late 60s spell out the mission in plain sight. Stockpile severely incapacitating and lethal materials, just for the CIA. And 3, keep a set of special and unique items ready to go at a moment's notice. In other words, MK-NAOMI was the CIA's personal poison factory and armory. The arsenal they built was straight out of a spy movie, except it was all real. One of the program's most infamous gadgets was a special pistol, which was actually shown to Senator Frank Church during his committee's investigation in 1975. It looked like a Colt 45 with a big scope, but it was virtually silent. It didn't fire bullets, it fired a tiny dart tipped with poison, no thicker than a human hair. That dart could hit a target from over a football field away, go right through their clothes, and deliver a poison designed to be undetectable in an autopsy. It would just look like a heart attack. The committee called it the perfect murder weapon. And that was just one item from a catalogue. The scientists at the Special Operations Division were masters of disguise. Declassified reports list an insane variety of murder weapons, fountain pens and umbrellas that could fire poison darts, and even an engine bolt designed to release a poison when the car heated up. They made briefcases and even fluorescent light bulbs that could silently spray a biological weapon into a room. They also held on to 8 milligrams of pure cobra venom. The freezers at Fort Detrick stored agents for smallpox, tuberculosis, and anthrax. MK-NAOMI wasn't just about killing people. One specific goal was to find a way to knock out guard dogs so spies could get into a secure area. They successfully made darts that could put a dog to sleep, and another agent that could wake the dog back up when the spies were leaving, so no one would ever know that they were there. They tried, but were never able to create a similar reliable knockout drug for humans. And it didn't stop there. A 1967 memo revealed the program had developed and tested at least 3 different secret techniques for attacking and poisoning enemy crops, turning biological warfare into economic sabotage. The whole thing was hidden under a level of secrecy that was almost fanatical. When the Church Committee started asking questions in the 70s, they hit a brick wall. In 73, the head of the CIA, Richard Helms, gave a verbal order to Dr. Sidney Gottlieb to destroy all the records for MKULTRA and MK-NAOMI. It was a systematic effort to erase a chapter of history, to make sure no one could ever get the full story. The project was so compartmentalized that most people working on it only ever saw their one tiny piece of the puzzle. Only a handful of men at the very, very top knew the full terrifying scope of the poisoner's toolkit they had built. For 20 years, the secrets of Fort Detrick were buried under layers of classification, but in the mid-1970s, the truth started to scratch its way to the surface. The thing that blew it all open was the Watergate scandal. It completely shattered the public's trust in the government and created a new political reality where, for the first time, Congress was willing to investigate its own intelligence agencies. On December 22, 1974, a journalist named Seymour Hersh published a bombshell story in the New York Times, exposing a massive illegal domestic spying operation by the CIA against anti-war protesters. The public was furious. In response, the Senate created a special committee to investigate abuses by the CIA, FBI, and NSA. It was led by an Idaho senator named Frank Church, and his name would go down in history. The Church Committee's investigation was a political earthquake. Through 800 interviews and thousands of declassified documents, the committee uncovered a shocking history of illegal government activity that had been hidden from everyone. They exposed COINTELPRO, the FBI's secret war against civil rights leaders. They uncovered CIA plots to kill foreign leaders like Fidel Castro. And they dragged the secrets of MKULTRA and its deadly brother MK-NAOMI out into the open. The testimony was mind-blowing. The committee heard CIA officials admit, on the record, to dosing unsuspecting Americans with LSD. They were shown the CIA's secret heart attack gun, and they uncovered proof that the CIA had directly defied a presidential order. In 1969, President Nixon had publicly renounced the use of offensive bioweapons and ordered all stockpiles destroyed. But the Church Committee discovered that CIA scientists, with the help from Fort Detrick, had secretly held on to that stash of 11 grams of shellfish toxin and other poisons. It was a flagrant violation of the law, justified inside the agency as a defensive measure. But it showed an agency that thought it was above the president himself. The revelations caused a firestorm of protest. People gathered at the gates of Fort Detrick, holding signs denouncing the evil of mass destruction that was researched inside. The trust between the American people and their government was broken. President Gerald Ford issued an executive order that explicitly banned political assassinations. Permanent intelligence oversight committees were set up in Congress, designed to be watchdogs that make sure this could never happen again. But a full accounting was impossible. The deliberate destruction of records in 1973 meant that we will never know the whole truth. How many people were drugged without their knowledge? What other weapons were made? How many were actually used? The cover-up in many ways worked. The full story of MK-NAOMI was buried with those files. And some of the evidence was buried literally. For years, hazardous waste from these programs was just dumped into pits and landfills around Fort Detrick. This led to severe groundwater contamination, with toxic chemicals poisoning the area. The base was eventually declared a Superfund site in 2008, a toxic legacy of its secret past that the residents of Frederick, Maryland are still dealing with today. The story of MK-NAOMI is a journey into the dark heart of the Cold War. It's a brutal reminder of what happens when fear and secrecy are allowed to poison science and democracy. It's the story of a program that weaponized the deadliest things on Earth, all because a government was paranoid that its enemy could control the human mind. For 20 years, operating in the shadows of its most famous sibling MKULTRA, this program built an arsenal of untraceable poisons and biological weapons, all for the purposes of assassination. But the real horror of MK-NAOMI isn't just the weapons, it's the human cost. It's in the story of the Operation Whitecoat volunteers, men who out of faith and patriotism let their bodies be ravaged by disease. They were told they were saving lives, never knowing the data from their suffering was also being used to perfect ways to take them. It's in the ghosts of the unknown victims, the prisoners and the patients who were treated as disposable testbeds. Their experiences are raised in a deliberate cover-up. The story of Fort Detrick is far from over. In our next investigation, we're going to look at the modern controversies that are still swirling around this base. From missing vials of deadly germs to a mysterious CDC-ordered shutdown in 2019 that some have tried to connect to another global catastrophe that happened around that time. The truth is often stranger and more terrifying than fiction. To be the first to see that investigation, make sure you're subscribed and notifications on. And we want to hear from you in the comments. What part of the declassified MK-NAOMI story do you find the most disturbing? We're going to read every single one. So, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.